Did technology change music? Of course it did. A look at how, up next on Science Goes to the Movies. Welcome to Science Goes to the Movies, a look at the stories of science and how they change our culture. I'm Lisa Beth Kovets. Today we've got Mark Katz, a University of North Carolina music professor, author, and former director of the UNC Institute for the Arts and Humanities. We're talking about two of his very interesting books, Build, The Power of Hip-Hop Diplomacy in a Divided World, and Capturing Sound, How Technology Has Changed Music. Hello, Mark.
Hello, thanks for having me.
In Rocketman, the musical film based on the collaborations of Elton John and Taupin, the viewer is treated to a behind-the-scenes glimpse at the spectacle of an Elton John concert. And we've become so accustomed to the technology that allows us to separate, then recombine the audio and visual components of music that we no longer see that as anything remarkable. But in his book, Capturing Sound, How Technology Has Changed Music, Professor Katz considers the changes that occurred when technology first invaded music. What was the technology that first separated music from its visual component?
Well, there had been technologies for centuries, like music boxes, for example, that had separated sound from sight. But it was really the phonograph, which was introduced in 1877, that separated the human body from its voice and from its sound. And that was something that was really disconcerting for people.
But it's hard to imagine now. What was so shocking about this new technology?
Well, one of the things I talk about in my book and the approach that I take is that I want people to think about this technology when it was new, as if they had never experienced it before. It's a hard imaginative leap, but if you can do that, you can get inside the heads and minds of people who first encountered it. So try to imagine that anytime you had heard music, live music of any, let's say a performance of any type of music, you had been in the room with the musicians. So that's how it would be if you were at a concert, if you were outside listening to music, if you were in a church or house of worship. So you always had a visual component. So when people started hearing music, particularly the human voice, when someone would sing without seeing the body, it really was disconcerting. People would look around, where is the person singing? And they did some really interesting things, at least at first, to try to compensate for it. Some people would look at photographs of performers while listening. I read of one opera enthusiast who created little cutout sets for all the operas he listened to so he could look at the sets while listening to the music. So it took a while before people could really learn how to listen to the phonograph. And that's something I really want to emphasize, that what seems so natural to us, we listen to music, disembodied music all the time, that was really strange and novel 100 or so years ago, and people had to learn how to listen to music that way.
It must have also changed how music was made.
It did. This technology didn't just capture these sounds. It didn't just record things and preserve them. It actually had an effect on how the music was made for so many reasons. I mean, one reason in the early days was that the recording horns, these gigantic horns that people had to play into before there were microphones, did not receive sound in a very efficient or sophisticated way. So people would have to play differently, or they would have to play different instruments even. Sometimes they would substitute an instrument for a tuba instead of a bass, or wood blocks instead of a drum. And then in the studio itself, it was so strange for people because, for example, there might be someone that they called a pusher who would stand behind the performer and hold on to them and literally push them towards the horn or pull them away from the horn if they were getting too loud or soft, because if it were too loud, it could blast the needle out of the groove. If it were too soft, it wouldn't be captured. So people had to learn how to perform for recording just as people had to learn how to listen.
Wow. Professor Katz shares fascinating details in his book, but because of time, we're going to focus on how that technological separation of visual and audio affected the jazz community. How did recorded music affect, first off, the popularity of jazz?
Well, one thing about recording is that it travels differently than live music. So it has a different kind of portability to it. And there are so many great stories of people listening to recordings in very remote places when they couldn't have heard the music otherwise. And in terms of jazz, what recording allowed was for people to hear and then learn jazz who were not in the big cities, who were very far away from any place they might hear live jazz. So there's the story of Bix Beiderbecke, who is a famous early trumpeter who is really nowhere near all the greats that he would have liked to hear. But with the recording, he was able to listen to people like Louis Armstrong and other famous jazz artists in Iowa, where that was his only opportunity. And what he would do is he would just play the recordings over and over and over again. So what we see is two aspects of this recording technology: the portability of it and the repeatability of it, that had a really profound impact on jazz.
But without the music, without the visual, did it also affect how they were learning the music? How, you know, if a young artist is hearing this the first time, he's not seeing the bowstring, he's not seeing the physicality. Did that make a difference to them?
It did, because of just what you were saying, that they couldn't see the gestures. They had to come up with their own ways of playing. And there's a funny story that I relate in the book where someone, a bass player, was listening to a recording and wanted to be able to play it himself. So he spent hours and hours, days and days listening to it over and over again. And he thought it was nearly impossible, but he finally mastered it. And it turned out that it was actually a duet. So there were two bass players, and that's the fact that he couldn't see it. He didn't know that there were two bass players. And so that's, in an interesting way, a deficiency of this technology allowed him to do something that no one would have tried otherwise, which is to play a duet as a solo.
He became extraordinary because of the lack of understanding. It's actually an amazing story.
And that's something that fueled a lot of performers. Is all they had was recordings in their basement. They would gather around with their friends, and they had to figure it out. So it was very different from the kind of classical training where you would be in the same room, you would be reading music. People had to fill in the blanks themselves.
You know, a lot of jazz fans want just the music coming at them and nothing else. But jazz has a significant social context. Did this separation of audio and visual change the social context of jazz?
It did, and it did this for jazz and rock and a lot of different kinds of music. One thing about the technology, because of its portability, it travels across racial lines. So people could listen to music, particularly African American people could listen to music at home that they couldn't listen to in public because they would have been barred from entering those spaces. There are some famous examples of multiracial bands playing and how much trouble they had. And in the recording studio, there was less trouble in doing that because you couldn't see. And there are lots of interesting examples of how people made assumptions about the race of a performer. And although this isn't jazz, that happened with Elvis. Many people hearing him for the first time in the early 50s when he started recording thought he was black. Right. And one story, I think it's true, is that the radio announcer would say, "This is Elvis Presley from such and such high school." And because the high schools, or who went to this high school, because the high schools were segregated, people knew immediately that he must be white.
Oh, really? In Rocketman and the Freddie Mercury biopic Bohemian Rhapsody, we see artists creating music in recording studios in the 1970s, and oh my God, the 1970s were forever ago. But in these scenes, we can see clearly that even in the 1970s, there are multiple microphones and isolated tracks. how can you record music without multiple microphones and isolated tracks? I mean, how could you do that?
Well, from the very earliest days, it was really just often a single horn and someone playing into it. There was no splicing, no overdubbing, no ability to do different tracks. If you messed up, you just had to start from the beginning. But after World War II, these new technological possibilities came on board. Splicing, for example, where you can put together two recordings that were done at different times so that they sound as if it's one seamless recording, or overdubbing, where you hear multiple voices sounding at the same time when they didn't perform at the same time. So these were still relatively new in the 60s, and the Beatles did so much to capitalize that. And then in Bohemian Rhapsody, there's some great scenes where you see them playing around with the technology, and I love those scenes because they show you just how much that the recording studio played a very fundamental role in the creation of music.
Are you talking about that scene and where they keep trying to sing the word Galileo again and again?
Yes, and in fact, there are two scenes that are both great. One an earlier scene where they're actually swinging a speaker from a wire to create a panning sound, and they're throwing pennies on the drum heads, and you could see the experimentation. And then later on, a few years later, when they're doing Bohemian Rhapsody, and you see they're asking the poor guy to sing Galileo at ever higher pitches. And one of the remarkable things about that song is just how constructed it was. There were only 3 people singing, but it sounds like a chorus of dozens.
So I can do that at my desktop now. You're saying that they didn't even in the 70s have the ability to make the sound feel like it's moving across the room?
Well, you could, but in the early years, people experimented in different ways in using speakers. But in terms of the overdubbing, they had to put it on tape, on actual physical, tape. And there's one mention that I thought was interesting in Bohemian Rhapsody, where they talk about wearing the tape thin. And that's something you had to worry about because you were recording something on top of the same tape over and over again, and it was going through the tape heads, and it really could do damage to the tape, and that was it. You didn't have the backups. You had to record it over again.
Right. Before the magnetic tape, avant-garde artists in pre-Nazi Germany were using technology to manipulate recorded sound. So what is gramophone music? So
this is, literally, if you think about it, it's music made from the gramophone. So the phonograph, the recorder. So there are these incredible experiments that people like Ernst Toch did in the 30s, where they did all the things that later became possible with tape, like overdubbing and splicing, but they did it with records, which is almost impossible to conceive because these weren't really re-recordable very easily. So they would have to record something. You'd have multiple phonographs. You would record something and then play it back and then record something onto another phonograph, a separate one, and then get a third one and play these 2 and record it on that one. And if you want to have 4 things sounding as if they were playing at the same time, then you would have to start 3 playing and record that, and so on and so on. So it was kind of crazy, but it anticipated a lot of the technological developments that came decades later.
So the art came first, or the desire to manipulate the sound was really deep in us before we got the technology to actually execute it.
Yes, and that's a really important point because a lot of people make assumptions about musical change and technology, that it's the technology that drives it. Well, you had splicing, so suddenly you did this, or you had overdubbing, so you could do Bohemian Rhapsody. But in fact, it's always been an interplay between the artists and the technology, where sometimes the artists are way ahead of the technology and try to do things that the technology doesn't yet allow, and sometimes the technology has capabilities that the artists haven't yet conceived of. So it's always this kind of dialogue between the technology and the users.
It's a push me, pull you. It brings one drags the other forward again and again.
Exactly, and it's really important to understand that we don't fall into kind of wonky academic term, technological determinism, which means like the technology made me do it, essentially, because that is often the way we think, and it's actually hard to get away from that. For example, my iPhone. I feel like my iPhone makes me not listen to my family at dinner, but in fact, it's not. It's that relationship between me and the technology that creates that.
But when you apply the technology to art, do you think that more is better? Do you think more technology makes for more interesting art, or are there pitfalls?
There are always pitfalls, and in fact, I take a different view of technology in music because I have a very broad view in which technology is pretty much everywhere, and it's always been part of music. So I consider instruments, musical instruments, to be technologies, sheet music to be technology. Most of the time we just think of technology as electronic or new, but the piano is an incredibly complex machine, and it's funny, when it first came on the scene several hundred years ago, people said, "Oh, it's this monstrous contraption. It's like it's like a furnace with, I mean, people compared it to machines very."
Wait, there was piano hate? People hated pianos when they...
There was a lot of piano hate because it replaced or was seen to replace the more genteel harpsichord, and people looked at it and said, "Oh, this beastly machine." But then what's so funny is 100 or more years later, or say in the 20th century, where you started to have player pianos, people said, "Oh, this horrible technology, the player piano, is replacing the beautiful natural piano." So it's always these cycles where an instrument or some kind of tool, when it's new, is seen as a technology and as inauthentic or as some kind of invader. But then when it becomes part of the musical landscape, it's naturalized, and then it's something new that threatens that old technology. So it's this continuous cycle where people are adopting, rejecting, and adapting technologies.
It sometimes seems to me, as a layperson, that the biggest thing to hit music was electricity. That electrifying music changed. There's no rock and roll without electric guitars. And that really made a huge change in our musical landscape once we got electricity.
Well, that's absolutely right. There's no doubting that electrification changed everything. The electric guitar is really its own instrument. It's quite different from an acoustic guitar. You can't really play an electric guitar without electricity. And think of the giant stacks of speakers that you see at rock concerts. I mean, that volume of sound, that power, the distortion that comes from electric guitars, from speakers.
The way it makes your body feel.
Exactly, and that is, it has a direct physical impact on us. If you go to a club, a dance club, you feel the bass in your chest. It's almost resonating with your heart.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt that electrification and these technologies that allowed for amplification just changed everything.
It made music a really visceral experience and not just an audio experience.
Well, in a different way, because one interesting thing to think about is that before all of this, you had to be in the presence of the performer, so it would have been visceral. And in fact,
interesting.
Even earlier on, before things got specialized and there were performers that just performed and listeners that just listened, everyone made music. So
Well, you mean every family, every institution, every grouping had a musical component to it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, but also just that music was part of everyday life. It wasn't separated into a class of musicians. If there was a ritual and people sang, you probably sang too. Or if there's dance, you would dance. Of course, there were specialists, but there wasn't the same kind of dedicated audience where they would just be silent and sit and listen. That's actually a fairly recent development in history.
Really? That's so interesting.
Yeah, the idea that we would be in comfy chairs like this and sit quietly, maybe look at a program, clap at certain points and not at others, is actually a fairly recent development. I mean, even in the 20th century. And it used to be much more freewheeling, where people would get up and eat oranges or throw oranges, or and then I'm just talking about classical music here.
Really?
Yeah, Italy was particularly rambunctious.
They have a lot of oranges.
Yeah.
In his book, Professor Katz describes how artists changed recording technology, even as recording technology changed artists, especially as it applies to hip-hop. So what did hip-hop bring to this technology and vice versa?
So hip-hop is fundamentally, at least historically, a technological genre, because the way it started was in the 70s. In the early 70s, DJs, young DJs in the Bronx, made a discovery, which is that dancers really liked certain parts of the record where it was just the drum beats. There was always a little solo called the break, and people, some people called it the get down part, because that's where people really got down. Some enterprising DJs like Kool Herc and African Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash, Grand Wizard Theodore, others like that, would isolate those drum breaks and play them over and over again. And then people really went wild, and popular, sort of the popular term for that is breakdancing, because they were dancing to the breaks. Now, to be really correct, most people that we would consider breakdancers prefer to call themselves b-boys or b-girls or breakers. But in any case, the story of hip-hop is, the birth of hip-hop is really about the relationship between DJs and dancers. And it was technological. And then the rise of rapping came because you had MCs, the master of ceremonies, who served in the traditional MC sense of announcing things, telling people someone, you know, the car has its lights on, or I found some keys. But then started to serve as hype men or hype women for the DJs, and then would throw in some rhymes, and really that's how hip hop came to be, was this real kind of exploitation of available technologies, recording technology, microphone, and it was enterprising teenagers who did this. That's something that's really incredible to remember, is that this multinational, global, multi-billion-dollar industry was created by teenagers.
That is extraordinary. Yes, we do forget that, how young people were when they were creating these things, when they were inventing these things for the first time. That's fascinating. And on September 4th, 2019, Hulu premiered the first episode of Wu-Tang: An American Saga. And early on in the saga, you see a young Bobby Diggs in the music store looking at a $2,000 drum machine. Yeah, so we're talking about all this great technology, but it's really quite expensive. Is the financial burden of the technology affecting art?
It does, but artists always find a way. So there are great stories of people like Grandmaster Flash, who would just walk around the Bronx, and he would find abandoned cars and pull out the stereos. He would create sound systems from whatever he could find. There are people who would just save up for months and months, would borrow equipment, would use their family's equipment. And then there are some famous anecdotes from the Great Blackout in New York in 1977, when there was a lot of looting that went on, and a lot of people acquired expensive musical gear. And I've interviewed some DJs who say, well, that's how I got my mixer, was when all went dark in 1977.
That's extraordinary. But it also forced them to be artists in a different way. You know, it forced them to be mechanical artists, mechanical wizards, putting all of this stuff together.
Exactly. They had to know how to fix the equipment, for one thing. Sometimes they built the equipment. And I've interviewed DJs who talk about these incredible things that they did, and how enterprising they are. One DJ said that he couldn't afford disco lights. So he took an umbrella, he punched holes in it, he hung it upside down and put Christmas lights in it and spun it. And those were his disco lights.
Very artistic.
Right, and very enterprising. So sometimes the cost of this technology, when it was out of reach, just forced people to be even more industrious.
Well, it must have changed the type of artist that could be a DJ.
Mm-hmm. It did, or it forced people to learn. Mm-hmm. But one thing that we're seeing now, and really in the last 10 or so years, as digital equipment becomes cheaper and cheaper, is that it lowers the barrier to entry for people to become DJs, producers, beat makers, composers, and so on, because now people can afford laptops and can use free software and can create music. So there are often these cycles where a new technology is introduced, it's way too expensive, people figure ways around it, and then it comes down and a new group of people comes in.
My ex-husband called MIDI musicians in debt indefinitely. Yeah.
Yes, in the early years, yes, but now this technology is a lot cheaper.
Right. Mark, thank you so much for spending time with us, and best of luck on the book.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.